Buzzkillers, it's the old professor here. We left you hanging last week at the stage being set for the Nuremberg Trials. And of course, we're here this week to talk about the trial themselves. And of course, by we, I mean Professor Nash, who you love more than anyone in our Buzzkill Institute. He's a research fellow here. He has an endowed chair, and he's by far our most important historian. And I think one of the great things about that episode last week, Professor, was you showed how complicated the whole just setting up the trial was. Yep. So here we are to talk about the Nuremberg trials themselves as they were going on.
Yeah, if you judge the trial from its outcome, you think, oh, that's pretty cut and dried, right? That's pretty simple,
these were
straightforward.
Obvious, yeah.
No, not at all. Yeah. Very complicated.
So again, then that was very enlightening. And then as we've been talking about this show and looking over the outline and things like that, I'm stunned at how, again, there are more complications in the trial, and it's not cut and dried, and there's back and forth and everything. So I've been floored by this whole topic because it just, again, illuminates so much more than I thought I knew. And I thought I knew pretty much because I tell my students about it and just talk about it like I was an expert. And I'm clearly not. All of you out there will be experts when we're done with this show. Okay, we had it all set up, and you even explained that the most important defendants, listed them. What were they actually charged with?
The defendants were charged with 4 crimes, or one or more of these crimes. Number 1, conspiracy to commit crime against peace. Mm-hmm. Planning, initiating, or waging aggressive war.
Right.
War crimes. So, in other words, violations of the laws of war, like killing civilians, mistreating prisoners of war, Geneva Convention type stuff. And then, for our purposes, in some ways, the most important category and the newest category, crimes against humanity.
Now, it seems to me the first 2, that happens all the time when someone goes to war.
Sure.
When someone starts a war anyway.
If you start a war that's not defensive, yes.
Those are not old. War crimes is kind of new, but crimes against humanity really is new.
Right, that is new. Absolutely.
Okay, so one of the fascinating things about last week's episode, of course, you talked about they had to have it in Nuremberg, partly because it was a surviving city in some ways. What was the structure of the court and of the trial?
Right. So just very quickly, each of the 4 allied powers was given 2 judges. And initially it was basically 1 judge and 1 alternate. But the judges quickly agreed that they would essentially act as a group of 8. You had a lead judge, but the alternate judges were very much involved in all of this.
Okay.
So you have 8 judges. There were 4 prosecution teams. The Americans was very large and in some ways too large. But we've got lots and lots of people and clerks and assistants and all these other people. So, and like I said, you had a division of labor among the prosecution teams. The small space in the courtroom, the courtroom was intact, but it was still pretty small considering everything they had to do. This is a space. You can go online and see the pictures. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can put something on the blog post, give you a sense. They even have color photographs of this. You can find them online. Pretty much a small space packed with the bench, the lawyers, the clerks, the translators, the defendants, guards, lots of guards ringing the room, spectators. They even knocked out a wall so they could create space for the press. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot going on in this courtroom.
What about the defense teams?
So you had the lawyers. I mean, obviously their lawyers are present. Each defendant, they were allowed to pick their own lawyers.
Oh, wow, okay.
And typically you do one-on-one, and they got to meet in private. So these were some of the sort of standard rights of defendants that were accorded them, certainly. But after many delays, the trial began on 20th of November, 1945. So once again, I mean, this is just months after the shooting has stopped in Europe. Not years, months.
It seems like a blink of an eye.
Yeah, pretty much. All the defendants pleaded not guilty. Mm-hmm. Goering tried to give a speech, and the judge cut him off, basically saying that you're not allowed to give a speech. Just guilty or not guilty.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
Not guilty, good, sit down, basically. The next day, the chief U.S. prosecutor, Robert Jackson, who was on leave from the United States Supreme Court, gave the opening speech, and everyone, apparently, even some of the defendants, were impressed by this speech.
Right, okay. Well, here is a clip of part of Jackson's speech.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This tribunal, while it is novel and experimental, is not the product of abstract speculation, nor is it created to vindicate legalistic theories. This inquest represents the practical effort of 4 of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 15 more, to utilize international law.
You hear the way he's characterized a part of the prosecution. How did the trial then go?
Right. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to bore people with going month by month, week by week through the trial. It's very, very long, very involved. It's not necessary, really. I can make some generalizations. You could say glass half full or half empty. I'm going to be pretty positive about this whole process at the end, but there were certainly lots of problems encountered in the course of the trial, one of which is one of the defendants killed himself. Robert Lye, who was head of the Reich Labor Front, he actually managed to strangle himself in his cell. And after that, they tightened up security quite a bit, as you might imagine. By the way, the defendants in their cells were being watched by a single guard at the door. The door of their cell had a window in it. They're being watched 24/7.
Wow. Each one of them?
Each one of them.
Okay.
Right. Especially after Lye hanged himself. There were also, throughout the trial, including and at the end of the trial, when the verdicts came down, there were always fears that there was going to be violent attack on the courtroom, on the area around the courtroom, that there might be a rescue attempt. For example, fanatical Nazis might come and try to spring the defendants.
These you mean like fanatical Nazis still around from the war?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I know they were, but I can't imagine they were that organized.
Yeah. Turns out that I think they exaggerated the magnitude of the threat, but they certainly worried about it. They worried about rescue attempts, things like that. There were also, as I think I implied earlier, there were defendants who clearly should not have been there.
Right.
The propagandist Fritzsche certainly shouldn't have been there. Franz von Papen, probably not. And when it comes to the organizations, right, by trying the institutions, a lot of this was a result of haste at the beginning, right? We said when we marveled at how quick this was. There were points where the haste got them in trouble. And what I mean in this case is the prosecutors putting together this case did not have a firm grasp on the nature of Nazi Germany and how it functioned.
That's a problem.
It is a problem. So, for example, like I said, one of the 6 institutions they tried was the cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Nazi cabinet was on paper only.
When
we talk about Adolf Hitler in those earlier episodes, you notice I never mentioned the cabinet.
Yeah,
because
that's right.
Because it existed on paper. He did not have cabinet meetings.
And
part of this is projection. If you look at the United States system or other parliamentary systems, the cabinet is very, very important for policymaking. Nazi Germany, not at all. If they had known more about how Nazi Germany functioned, they would never have named that as one of its illegal institutions.
So when we talk about the Nazi General Staff, Nazi High Command, really talking about the top of the military.
That's
things.
right.
There isn't a political cabinet, so to speak.
Right. There's no political cabinet, so the cabinet itself really shouldn't be there. There was no general staff, quote unquote. That was not a thing. I mean, yeah, you had an officer class. You had this sort of not Nazi, but sort of military elite. But there's really no coherent thing called a capital G, capital S general staff that you can indict. The brown shirts, the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers, after the Night of the Long Knives, after that organization was sort of decapitated and put in its place in the middle of 1934, pretty meaninless, pretty useless in terms of, you still had stormtroopers. They still had a public role to play, but it was not an important institution, and it wasn't responsible for any of these crimes. Really shouldn't have been there.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating.
So if you want to say, how did this trial screw up? I would say largely in its indictment of some of these organizations. They really missed the boat. There was also, pretty quickly, it was discovered that demonstrating this conspiracy charge was very, very difficult. And this was not helped by the fact that the U.S. prosecution, this often gets overlooked, but from what I've read, the U.S. prosecution was fairly ineffective. That Robert Jackson was an inspirational figure, a key driving force behind this whole enterprise, but a very poor manager and a very poor trial lawyer.
That's amazing, given he was a Supreme Court
judge.
I
mean, there you're not running a big sprawling institute. In the ways, apples and oranges. But he was not cut out for this. He famously could not control Hermann Goering under cross-examination. Under examination. Basically lost control of the witness, and it got really ugly at one point where he's sort of, in his frustration, he's calling out for the judges to bail him out, and the judges refuse. The judges are like, "It's your show, counselor. You control your witness. It's not on us." Wow. And so that was kind of awkward, and not, the United States, for being a driving force behind this, doesn't typically get as high marks as some of the other teams involved. Prosecutorial teams.
Probably,
Yeah,
okay.
certainly not compared to the British. Basically get very high marks.
But obviously it went well enough.
Went well enough. Yeah, like as I hinted a minute ago, I think the outcome was largely very favorable for lots of reasons. And if you're wondering, like, despite all the pitfalls and difficulties and challenges, how did it go? Well, the elephant in the room here in some ways is just the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Mountains
by
of
the
evidence.
way, using the right term, the elephant in the room.
The elephant in the room, mountains of evidence. And if you were trying to be reductionist, like what single factor hanged these people, literally and figuratively, it was the evidence.
Yeah.
And the stereotype here is largely true. The Germans were very fastidious before and during the war. They typically documented everything. This was the modern bureaucratic state on steroids. Everything's in triplicate, everything's typed, everything's filed. And here, I have to give a shout out, as I often do in my own work, I have to give a shout out to the archivists. And by this, I mean the German archivists. Because apparently, I think you mentioned this. And by the way, the Nazis did destroy a lot of stuff at the end of the war.
Yeah, yeah.
There were lots of full burn bags in the spring of 1945. But there were apparently many cases where German archivists, the people who keep the paper, were basically told, burn all this stuff. And a lot of them didn't do it.
Wow.
A lot of them disobeyed.
We should also remind the Buskos, the top of the Nazi command, the top of the Nazi party, they want to have a record of everything because they're very proud of it.
That's right. Right. Until it might
Until
be used
yeah,
to
yeah,
convict
yeah.
them. And it's like, oh, we need to get rid of this. Think just, for example, what I've seen when preparing for my Holocaust class. We mentioned in another show, the Wannsee Conference, early 1942. It's basically this big coordinating meeting for the Holocaust. The minutes were taken by Adolf Eichmann. There were 16 copies. 15 were destroyed.
But
you only need one.
exactly.
And it becomes a key piece of evidence in establishing the history of the Holocaust.
By the way, Buskos, as you know, Professor Nash provides these wonderful outlines for us to work so we can have a good flowing show. And every now and then I have to read out one of his great bon mots from the and here he has written badass archivists, because as historians we love archivists, but when they're really badass like this,
They deserve the props. So it's in a way, in this whole story, some of the proudest Germans, or people who can be
Hold their heads up,
justifiably
yeah.
proud of their performance, the archivists of all people. Yeah. I think it's pretty cool. Like I said, if anything, the challenge is not too little evidence, it's too much. That's sifting it all out.
That's
but some of it,
That's
I mean,
astounding.
not to get too deep in the weeds, but something like the Hossbach Memorandum of November 1937, which it says who's in the room as they are openly discussing the aggressive war they're going to wage in a few years down the road. It's a smoking gun, and it's on paper, and you can't question its authenticity, although
Right.
in that case there were a couple of doubts, but it was established as authentic, and then there it is. It's just staring right at you. So the prosecution overall, and the prosecution, by the way, its job is between November 1945 and March 1946, so what's that, about 5 months. Fairly effective overall, including their presentation of not just documentary evidence, because this was not just about paper.
yeah.
Both the Soviets and the Americans showed newsreel footage. In fact, the American Army actually produced a documentary film called Nazi Concentration Camps. And this was played in the courtroom. Everyone was shocked, including some of the defendants. There were people weeping. There were people who basically had to leave the room. I think there was at least one person who passed out. Some of the eyewitness testimony, of course, was quite compelling. They got some pretty important, including some German general, like Friedrich von Paulus, the guy who surrendered at Stalingrad. He was brought in as a prosecution witness, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. Generally speaking, the prosecution was fairly effective. People shouldn't get too caught up in some of their missteps and the problems they ran into. The defense put their case forward between March and July 1946. All the defense attorneys were given a lot of leeway. The defendants typically denied responsibility or knowledge, or, not surprisingly, blamed those who were dead or absent. Lots of blaming of Hitler. Right? It wasn't me, it was him. A lot of lying. And at times directly contradicted by evidence which was then presented in cross-examination. There were a few very skilled defense attorneys, some who were like even sort of admired by the prosecution. But I think my assessment would be, generally speaking, the quality of defense lawyer was lower than the quality of prosecutors.
By the way,
they also have a much tougher job.
Well, yeah. I just imagine these defense lawyers after the trial. It must have been something that people could beat you over the head with for the rest of your career.
Well, except to keep in mind that a lot of people in the German public don't necessarily support this process.
Oh,
right? And
yes,
if you're a
of
German
course.
lawyer looking to drum up future German legal business, this might not hurt you. It might actually help you.
Okay, I didn't think of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure. Some of these folks didn't do very well on cross-examination. The two quoque arguments were tried repeatedly by the defense, but they were basically quashed by the judges. The judges got along amazingly well, even the Soviet judges. And once again, I think you alluded to it. If you know anything about Stalin's Soviet Union,
Yeah.
you could imagine this not going very well. But even the couple of the Soviet judges who were selected turned out to be pretty good choices, fairly cooperative. There were disagreements. The Soviets typically wanted everyone to be convicted and executed, but they weren't. But the wrangling was, for the most part, kept behind the scenes, even though there were certainly tensions.
Yeah.
Most disputes were successfully handled. I think Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, who was the chief British judge and basically the equivalent of the chief justice, he sort of presided. Everyone gives him high marks. Very, very sharp, very fair, very dignified. Did a lot to sort of establish the credibility of this whole enterprise.
Sounds like a Man Crush Monday possibility.
Ooh, maybe.
I'll have to look
Sir
into
Geoffrey
it, yeah.
Lawrence. I'm going to take a look.
Well, Professor, we have to take a break. So we'll come back in a moment, Buzzkillers, and talk about, among other things, the verdicts. Okay, we are back. Now, Professor, this trial doesn't take that long, surprisingly. November 45 to July 46. The OJ trial takes longer.
Well, July 46 is when the defense sort of rests, and then you have a couple more months.
Oh, I see.
before-
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
So it's,
So even
it's into the fall, but still.
Yeah, less than a year. The OJ trial was longer. We left the Buzzkillers hanging. What were the verdicts?
So the judges did not buy much of the conspiracy charge, or they didn't buy much of the idea that this all started in 1933.
Uh-huh.
So in their deliberations, went on for weeks behind closed doors, their deliberations quickly narrowed the temporal scope, sort of later in the 30s and then during the war, of course. And also they weren't so impressed by the conspiracy charges. 4 organizations they found criminal: the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, right, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS Security Service, and the Nazi Party leadership, the top 2 ranks. They have they have national ranks and regional ranks and then local ranks and village ranks. So the low-level Nazi Party functionaries, by the way, we would have been talking about tens of thousands of defendants.
Yeah.
So you can imagine why they did that just for practical terms. Just the top 2 ranks, that was considered declared a criminal organization. The cabinet, the brown shirts, the general staff / high command were acquitted. And just to tie in with another one of our earlier episodes, when we talked about the clean Wehrmacht myth.
Oh, yeah.
I was interested to learn. Apparently, this played a role, maybe a minor role, in establishing that concept. In other words, we find the General Staff and High Command not to be a criminal organization. Well, then if you're trying to establish it as a clean organization, you can point to this and say, look, we were exonerated at Nuremberg. So the judges clearly weren't thinking about that. In fact, the Wehrmacht myth is only going to be really put together in the early 50s, like long after this. But I thought that was interesting. 12 of the individuals were convicted of crimes against peace. Counts 3 and 4, so war crimes and crimes against humanity, they held up the best. Those were clearly, in the eyes of the judges, those were the strongest cases.
And those are the 2 basically new types of charges.
Well, newer or new, for sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, especially the crimes against humanity. There were only 2 acquittals.
Wow.
In these cases, in counts 3 and 4. There was a lot of wrangling over sentencing. By the way, 2 separate processes, right? Who's guilty, who's not. Those who were guilty, what do we do with them? There were 12 death sentences. 10 were carried out. So remember Martin Bormann, he was tried in absentia, so they would love to have hanged him, but they couldn't. And famously, Hermann Goering cheated the hangman by biting down on a cyanide capsule very shortly before he was to be hanged. The U.S. Army executioner, I have to do a little sidelight on this guy because he's very interesting. So the chief executioner was a U.S. Army Master Sergeant by the name of John C. Woods. From everything I've read, he was an incompetent hangman.
Wow. Which is probably hard to do.
It is. Well, I mean, no. I mean, to do it right, you actually have to know what you're doing.
Oh, okay. All right.
And he lied to get his job. Basically, during the war, the U.S. Army said, we need a hangman. Who's interested? And he stepped up and said, I've taken part in all these executions back in the States. And he lied about it. And they didn't do the slightest bit of background check. Like, for example, he was claiming to have taken part in hangings in states like Oklahoma, where they had long moved on to the electric chair. So in other words, he couldn't have been telling the truth. Anyway, he got the job.
Okay.
He executed a whole bunch of people before this, but he wasn't very good at his job. And when it comes to hanging, rope length is everything.
Yeah.
Not to go too gory, but you want to break the neck. And so the rope can't be too long or too short. If it's too short, you don't break the neck, and then the person strangles to death.
Right.
So apparently, there were several defendants who strangled to death for minutes. I've seen estimates of up to 25 minutes.
Oh.
People strangling to death. rather than, and by the way, I mean, if you're interested in this, and I warn you, they were gruesome, you can go online and see the photographs. They took a picture of each guy after he had been hanged, and they put him on a stretcher and took his picture, and you can tell that a few of these did not go right. I'll just put it that way. I do have to add that later on in the Pacific, out in one of the American-held islands in 1950, Woods was accidentally electrocuted while trying to repair an electronic light set.
Yikes.
So the executioner was executed, I guess you could
Yeah.
say. So there were certainly some inequities in sentencing.
Yep.
Albert Speer, he did a marvelous job of sort of spinning himself into sort of an honorable person, both during the trial and afterwards. He got 20 years, and he served his 20 years. There's the good news. But Fritz Sauckel, also knee-deep in slave labor, was executed.
Right.
And it seems pretty clear that the judges were very impressed by Speer's sort of his persona, his intellect, how highly educated he was, and so they didn't want to kill him. The judges were not perfect in their impartiality.
Yeah.
Or even someone like Julius Streicher, who, like I said, he's going to get his own POS Saturday. For as vile as a human being as he obviously was, did he really deserve the death penalty? He's guilty of incitement. And you cannot establish that Act X was a result of the anti-Semitic caricatures he had in his newspaper.
Right.
So that's a little problematic. What exactly was his responsibility? Bad guy? Sure. Horrible anti-Semite, probably the worst ever? Yeah, absolutely. Under the terms of this trial, should he be executed? I honestly don't know.
All right. Well, let's go back to the original, what we talked about last week, and also what you've sort of implied throughout this show. That original charge that it's going to be a show trial. It's a kangaroo court, victor's justice, which is another big one. What happens to that?
To that idea, yeah.
Yeah.
I would put this in the strongest possible terms. I think if anyone looks at the Nuremberg trial and says, oh, that was show trial, or that was victor's justice, that's someone who doesn't know the first thing about how this trial went down.
Right.
I would say, if that's your inclination, I would say look into this. And don't just take it from me. Go read. There are lots of excellent books on the Nuremberg trial. Look at them. You'll very quickly be disabused of this notion. There were 3 complete acquittals.
Yep.
Von Pappenschacht and Fritzsche were all acquitted, and a lot of people were surprised. A lot of Germans were, and a lot of defendants were, because I said a lot of people had bad faith. A lot of people assumed that this was just a legal gloss over a foregone conclusion. It was not. There were 3 acquittals. And by the way, there were lots of other people who were found guilty of some things but acquitted of others.
Oh, right. Okay. Well,
there were 4 possible charges. There's a chart on Wikipedia. It's very useful. You can go look it up. Lots of acquittals on individual charges, especially the conspiracy charge.
yeah. So there's a sensitivity to the complexity of all
Absolutely,
that.
yeah. They're not just saying bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good guy. No, they're doing this by the letter of the law that they have established. More than a proper defense was allowed. You get to pick your own attorney. Many defense motions were granted, and prosecution motions were denied, which is not what you have seen in a show trial.
No, not when you go to the Stalinistic trials or the Mao trials.
Exactly.
That's not what happens. Yeah.
Right. Actually, if you look at time in court, the defense was given more time than the prosecution to put out their case, which you would not have expected in a show trial. The defense could cross-examine prosecution witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. I've already cited a couple of cases where the judges were obviously, if not impartial, trying to be impartial. The prisoners were treated humanely. In fact, I forget who it was. One of the defendants, I think it was Hans Frank, just before he was executed, some of his last words were I appreciate how well I was treated in here, which,
wow.
Wow, exactly, right? So,
well, maybe they thought they were going to be tortured and all kinds of things.
Well, maybe they were projecting because they knew how they treated
people.
Well,
exactly. Yeah.
They had no right to expect this sort of humane treatment. Like Hermann Goering, when they captured him, he was grossly overweight and he was addicted to morphine. And they put him on a diet and he dropped like 60 or 80 pounds and they weaned him off of morphine. I mean, it's like he went to the spa. I'm sorry. Yeah. That's super glib. These people were treated pretty well, considering. And in all these senses, I would say, if your question is, did this IMT successfully seize the moral high ground? I think the answer is a resounding yes.
Okay, that's a big statement. We need to reemphasize that the moral high ground
because that
was successfully
because
seized.
That's maybe not a stated goal.
Yeah.
That's an implicit goal.
Yeah.
But it's still a goal, and I think they achieved it.
Well, especially when, a lot of the history, when we look at history, it's so complex and we often have to reevaluate the glib conclusions that people come to. This is a very interesting one, and sort of gratifying.
Right. Or to put it another way, it's easy to become cynical about these sorts of things.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
And I think, in this sense, we need to put a check on it.
Okay. Now, the Nuremberg trials that was the famous one. Were there other ones?
By the way, there was supposed to be a second trial put on by the IMT of the industrialists, but that never came together, in part because the Allies are starting to squabble and fall apart and have more disputes. So you did not have a second IMT trial. You had several subsequent trials that were just put on by the United States. In Nuremberg, but it was just the U.S. It was not the IMT. And these are, you can look these up. These are called the Nuremberg military tribunals. So it's not.
I can
the
imagine
IMT.
a lot of people get these conflate these things.
Right.
Yeah.
And these were not nearly as famous. If you study things like the Holocaust, they're pretty well known. But so these were trials of particular functional groups between 1946 and 1949. So they went on for several years. These would include the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen. These are the German death squads, killing Jews and communists and others in the East by firing squad. The doctors, the ones who did the medical experiments in places like Auschwitz. There's a whole list of them. There was a separate trial for judges. There was a separate trial for generals, etc. And there were also lots of trials, which often get forgotten, trials that were done on a national basis in the context of national legal systems in places like France and Poland in particular. The commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, not to be confused with Rudolf Hess, he was tried and executed in Poland. If people have seen Schindler's List, the Nazi in that, Amon Goeth, played by Ray Fiennes, he was tried and executed by the Poles. So there were lots of high-level war criminals and criminals against humanity who were tried on a national basis. They don't get the attention because it's not just this one single high-profile event. There was, however, certainly lots of disappointment afterwards. A big picture, and if you're going to criticize, maybe the IMT doesn't deserve criticism for this. The Allies certainly do. In terms of, we may have mentioned this in another show as well, but the overall record of hunting down, catching, and trying perpetrators of Nazi crimes is actually very poor.
That's very surprising.
Very poor,
Very
especially.
surprising.
Part of it's a seniority thing. You know, you've got the high-profile people who typically either kill themselves or do get caught at some point, although some of them evade justice for a long, long time. Josef Mengele dies not at the hands of justice, but he dies in Brazil in 1987. Right? A lot of these people got away. Mid to lower level people almost all got away. The vast majority of Holocaust perpetrators and war criminals were never punished.
That's astounding. That's just astounding.
And then a lot of other people who were punished, including some of those in these trials at Nuremberg, they got their sentences commuted in the 1950s. You know, people sentenced to 20 years and they served 3, that kind of thing. That happened quite a bit. And that was partly about patching up the relationship with West Germany after World War II. And it's a real sad story. But a lot of these people, they serve a few years or it's time served, basically, while they're being held for trial. And then they go on to lead perfectly productive lives and die in the 1970s and 80s after having made a lot of money. That was much more common than someone getting life or getting executed for their crimes. Much more common.
Well, that leads right into this question of legacies. I mean, the legacies are obviously now complicated by these things, but we watched Judgment at Nuremberg, the film, and we come away with a sort of feel-good notion.
Right. Sadly, there's some disappointments here, too. Partly, it all depends on where you put the bar. If you establish the bar as people like Robert Jackson did, which, you know, or Henry Stimson, are you creating a new era of international relations governed by law? The quick answer is no, they did not.
Yeah.
They failed. There is no new international legal order when it comes to these questions. There is an international legal order, don't get me wrong. International law is a thing that's very important. But they did not establish what they tried to establish. Aggressive war, just to put it very bluntly, aggressive war crimes, and genocide still occur and are still occurring in 2023. They're going on right now. All 3 of them, by the way, in multiple places. And typically, when you engage in these activities, there are few, if any, consequences.
And that's, what we're seeing it now with Ukraine and all kinds of other things.
Hopefully we will live long enough to see if there are any consequences for the people who have brought us that war. Apart from just suffering a little bit under economic sanctions or whatever. I'm not going to hold my breath.
I'm not going to hold my breath either. Is there any good news?
Is there any good news? Absolutely yes. And like I said earlier, in an earlier context, glass half full, half empty. Yes, you can make a real strong case that the glass is half empty. I can make a case it's at least a quarter full. That's
actually pretty good. Considering human nature.
Considering the obstacles, considering human nature, considering an anarchic international system with no world government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, considering what we're up against. It is harder to commit such crimes these days than it was in the 1940s. The precedent has been set. No one disputes the idea that individuals can be held accountable for government crimes. I would argue that has a huge value all on its own. Even at the level, I'm just thinking of the level of public discourse. It is not okay today to say, I was just following orders. If you say that after you've done something bad, you will immediately be mocked by anyone with a high school education.
Right.
And I don't think that was the case in 1940. In 1940, you would have had, even in our military, you would have had people, well, yeah, what do you mean illegal order? I do what the boss tells me to do. I think that would have been much more common and much more commonly accepted than it is now. And we can thank the Nuremberg trial for that in part. At least that concept has dealt a serious blow for sure. And by the way, in recent years, there have been some perpetrators who have been punished. There is an international criminal court at The Hague, which is the outgrowth of these earlier international criminal trials, one with former Yugoslavia and one in Rwanda.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And let's forget, you remember, what's his name? Slobodan Milosevic?
Yeah.
He died in prison.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear that he had a heart attack because he had been convicted. I'm just sort of putting two and two together. I don't know his personal health records. I remember they covered that trial, and he was just so outraged that he was even being held to account. He couldn't fathom that he was being tried by this international court. And I think that's a huge moral victory right there, if you look at what he was responsible for.
Yeah, and by the way, he's a future POS Saturday if this show continues for another couple decades, because people will have started to forget him already.
Yeah, for sure. Or some of those other people involved.
Yeah.
I'll put it this way. If you are committing war crimes or crimes against humanity today, you have to look over your shoulder the way no one did in 1943.
Yeah. Yep.
I think that's how I would put it. Will you be held to account? Probably not. But you have to worry about it. You're going to think twice. And I would say, once again, I'll take the baby step. I will take that little bit of progress compared to the alternative. And in some ways, the good news was not long-term, but it was immediate. In the context of 1945-46, top Nazis were definitely held to account. Key evidence was collected and preserved, and partly for historians.
Yeah.
Like I said, that was one of the goals, establishing a record, and they did that. They have volumes of supporting evidence. Historians still rely on a lot of that evidence in their work related in lots of ways to the history of Nazi Germany and World War II. So just the fact that they gathered and preserved that evidence, that deserves a great deal of applause. And like I said earlier, I've said several times, considering the huge challenges involved, this was a major success. This was a fair and relatively speedy trial that held top Nazi perpetrators to account. And at a time when people feared vengeance, they feared that this was just going to be retaliation, summary execution, just like murder begetting murder. The extent that people feared that, this court, this IMT delivered justice instead. And I think if that's how you frame it, I think that means they passed a really important test.
Yes. Again, let me go back to Professor Nash's notes and outline here. Justice was served for the most part, and I think that's crucial. So when, again, we always like to talk about the ways history is misrepresented in movies and things like that. And we haven't studied Judgment at Nuremberg, the famous film, specifically, although maybe we should do that. When people think back on this and when they look at the film clips and when they look at that movie in particular, has it been portrayed fairly accurately?
That's a good question. By the way, there was another, I saw part of it, not all of it. More recently, I want to say in the 90s, there was actually, I think it was a miniseries that had Alec Baldwin playing Robert Jackson.
Holy cow.
And Brian Cox played Hermann Goering. It's been so long since I've seen Judgment at Nuremberg. I will withhold judgment, so to speak. Yeah, I wonder how well that holds up. Honestly, I don't know, to answer your question. But certainly, the Nuremberg trials are not in the public consciousness the way they were after that movie came out, or after Rise and Fall of the Third Reich came out, same year, I believe, 1960. So, yeah, I think it's always valuable to revisit these things in case it's fallen off the radar screen.
Well, like so many interviews with Dr. Nash, we come up with ideas for new shows, and that could be one of them. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Thanks for, this is a two-parter. Those are always hard to do, but I know that people have listened all the way to the end, and again, with sort of bated breath because it's so fascinating.
I agree, and thanks for having me on.
Buzzkillers, we will talk to all of you next week.